on U.S.-China relations, coming to you live from New York City. And I am pleased to welcome thousands of viewers to our 19th annual China Town Hall. Both those watching at one of our nearly 70 partner venues throughout the United States, Canada, and China, and those watching independently. We created China Town Hall to bring together Americans from all walks of life to discuss the importance of U.S.-China relations. It is impossible to deny that the impact that this relationship is having on our lives, and the last 4 months have seriously tested its durability. Even while U.S. and Chinese leaders expressed interest in maintaining communication, high tariffs coupled with Chinese government retaliation have caused businesses to scramble to secure their supply chains. Prices are projected to rise and economies to slow. At the same time, the space for cooperation, already limited, is shrinking further. How did the U.S.-China relationship get to this point, and where is it headed? Since its inception in 1966, the National Committee has been committed to holding frank conversations that bring a wide range of perspectives. And that is certainly true tonight. We are thrilled to have with us three distinguished China experts with differing points of view who will discuss the current state of U.S.-China relations and answer your questions. First, Ling Wei, chief China correspondent at the Wall Street Journal and a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2021. Next, Matthew Turpin, visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, who from 2018 to 19 served as the U.S. National Security Council's Director for China and a senior advisor to the Secretary of Commerce. Finally, Ryan Haas, Director of the China Center at the Brookings Institution, who served as the NSC's Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia from 2013 to 2017. To participate in conversation online, use the hashtag CTH2025. You can also scan the QR code at the bottom of the screen to take the CTH survey and share your thoughts on current U.S.-China policy. Let me now begin with a few of my own questions for our distinguished panel. Matt, turn to you because you served in the prior Trump administration. Tariffs are on top of everybody's mind. Can you give us the administration's argument for the tariffs? And before we do that, let's look at one of the polls on the impact of tariffs that the participants believe will have on the U.S. economy and their lives. Question is, do you think Trump's high tariffs on Chinese goods will hurt or help the U.S. economy in the short term? 93% say it will help. In the long term, we have that poll?
Yeah, hurt.
In the mid-long term? All right, we don't have, there we are.
Yeah.
There it drops to 77% with 9% thinking it will help. Give us the argument.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, thanks, Steve, so much for having me. And it's a real pleasure to be with Ryan and Ling, two great friends. So first of all, I want to just say I am not a surrogate for the administration. So I'm going to give what I think is my assessment of what I think their worldview is and sort of what they're trying to achieve, right? So I think that's important to understand. Often this gets sort of framed as just tariffs. And I think what we have to understand that I think the President of the United States has a worldview that he believes that a rules-based international order is now an incredible burden on the United States, that you have a global trading system that is undermining the long-term interests of the United States, and therefore he seeks to change and re-engineer the global trading system to be something more advantageous for the United States. And he is also seeking to re-industrialize the United States. He feels that decisions made in the 1990s around what we colloquially consider to be globalization have really placed the United States at a disadvantage by hollowing out manufacturing. And it's very difficult for the United States to be the kind of power that it needs to be in the world without that, and to be completely dependent, for the most part, on the PRC, which is in many ways quite hostile to the United States. And so I think that's his worldview. His goal is to sort of achieve that re-engineering of a global trading system, and tariffs are a tool in the toolbox to achieve that. And I think he believes that the tariffs are a particularly good negotiating tool because the executive branch has broad authorities to impose those tariffs without Congress has delegated many of those authorities. But I think it's also clear that he is using a variety of other tools, whether those are outbound and inbound investment screening and restrictions, export controls, things in terms of tax changes inside the United States. All of those things are meant to achieve a set of goals around changing a trading system and reindustrialization. Right? That's what they're trying to achieve.
Ryan, the tariffs have gone up, they've gone down, they've been suspended, only to be reapplied shortly thereafter. What do those changes reveal about the Trump administration's priorities?
Well, Steve, let me just say at the outset that if the Trump administration had Matt as a spokesperson, I don't think that we would have 93% of the people being polled saying that it's going to hurt.
It was a very articulate answer.
Thank you.
But
I'll pay you later.
I have to just admit that the experience of the past nearly 100 days has felt a little bit like going into surgery, but being kept awake for it. It's been painful to watch. And I say that as someone who had a view and wrote that President Trump entered his second term with a very strong hand to play with respect to China. When he came into office, the economy was strong, our alliances were sound, and the United States was a magnet for capital and talent from around the world. President Trump also did something that no other politician in the United States was willing to do, which was to show respect to Xi Jinping throughout the presidential campaign. If you listen to his message on China, it was basically that the United States, under President Trump, will be tough and firm, but will also work well with President Xi to get deals done and will avoid war. That resonated, I think, with the American people, but it also created a useful on-ramp for the U.S.-China relationship. And yet, unfortunately, instead of delivering concrete results, what we've seen is chaos for the past 100 days. And I don't think the chaos is a function of a policy process gone awry. I think it's a reflection of the fact that President Trump is his own desk officer on China issues. He is driving a lot of the decisions, the fluctuations that we're talking about, and that's a very difficult problem to solve. And so I think the flux that we've seen that your question pointed us towards is probably going to be something that's going to be with us for a while.
Ling Ling, over the last few weeks, we've seen President Trump being vocal about his unhappiness with the Fed chair, Jerome Powell, though he said he's not looking to fire him recently, but he's complained about not lowering interest rates. In the context of what's going on in the tariff standoff with China, if interest rates were lowered, as Trump suggests, how might it impact the U.S. economy? By the way, that question comes from James O'Brien from Bryant University. Unfortunately, we can't get him online.
Sure. Steve, thank you very much for having me. It's such an honor to be with two legends in the U.S.-China space. I love that question because that's what a business journalist is, supposed to know about. Lower interest rates, obviously would reduce the cost of borrowing. That could, spur investment, business investment and consumer spending, and also can help bolster markets, stock markets, bond markets, overall economic activity in the United States. So, in theory, lower interest rates could help put the United States in a stronger position in any potential negotiations with China. So that's why he's really, all over the Fed about, the need to lower interest rates, especially given the tariffs have this inflationary effects on the economy.
Another tool in the toolbox.
Exactly, a tool in the toolbox, right.
Except it's not his tool.
It's not his tool.
It's Jerome Powell's tool.
And I just wanted to say one thing. You know, we have done a lot of comparison between the U.S. and China. You know, fundamentally different systems. You know, what the U.S. has is this credibility and also independence of the Fed, right? That has given the U.S. dollars and the U.S. market so much power, right?
Yeah.
That's made the U.S. the investment destination for global investors. China, the central bank, as we all know, has zero independence. So we do not want to have our Fed here lose any kind of independence because of political pressure. I'm telling you, it's not just investors in bond market, in stock market watching. China is watching this play out as well.
Matt, China has not responded in any constructive way. There just has been retaliation. There have been restrictions on exports, especially of rare earths, which is deeply damaging. How has that affected the Trump folks' consideration of this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, my assessment of China's response up to this point, and, you know, retaliatory tariffs on their side, so, you know, U.S. exports to China and, you know, seeking to replace with other imports, you know, so things are looking very good for Brazil in terms of agricultural exports to China. You know, and so that has a very real potential negative impact over time and potential political blowback as that hits certain communities and constituencies much harder. But I would question, though, the ideas around critical minerals and the restrictions on critical minerals. These things strike me as much more China's efforts to find something that they can match as reciprocal to U.S. export controls. But as someone who had spent quite a bit of time doing export control policy, it is really not a wise idea, objectively, to impose export controls on commodities. China's dominance in critical mineral processing is only because they make them artificially cheap, right? So when you deny those things to the world, it does allow for others to produce those things, right? Processing of germanium is not a technologically advanced activity. It's cutting-edge 1970s technology. Lots of countries around the world used to make and process germanium. They don't anymore because China makes it artificially cheap. If it denies those things to the world, others could make those things.
Right.
And so it's not a potentially...
How long would that take to kind of build up production? And,
well, in
because some
many
of these
ways,
things are only available for China.
Issue,
yeah,
right?
It's not,
so
not at all.
it is really not a new issue.
Yes, correct.
So what we've seen is a lot of stockpiling. And we've seen preparations that folks have taken, whether it's in Australia or Malaysia or, you know, various countries have begun to figure out what are ways they could fill gaps. And I think, you know, what we're going to find is that there will be a muddle through. I think we should take, you know, at sort of face value the experience that China's embargo on critical minerals and rare earths on Japan in 2010 and 2011 around a dust-up over the Senkakus. The reality was that China imposed those. It certainly imposed some costs on Japan. Japan began to build around those things and stand up alternatives and find ways to work around it. And China called those things off within 18 months because they found that they weren't working.
Yeah.
And so those are not, objectively, they're not good export controls. Don't export control things that are commodities. Yeah. And that's sort of essentially, other than advanced batteries and some advanced manufacturing around some magnets, those are kind of the only areas that they've got that they have a technological advancement on that others can't make.
No question, that's correct. If you restrict the export, then others are going to find the market.
Yep.
Can the same be said of semiconductors? That we have
very difficult.
But hasn't China succeeded now in Huawei and others in kind of developing some pretty good?
So.
You don't think so?
I think what we're watching is a very, very real efforts on their part to do so. But you know, I think we should have to remember that the United States has maintained dual-use export controls on semiconductors since the 1960s, since they were invented. We have a whole regime around this. And the United States, along with some of its key allies, have maintained, you know, a generational advantage on manufacturing advanced semiconductors for quite some time. I mean, I think what we're seeing now is, you know, reports around a Huawei chip that is some subset below an H20 NVIDIA GPU. An H20 NVIDIA GPU is quite a bit beneath the cutting edge of NVIDIA's GPUs that they are not allowed to sell to China, right? And so this is a dynamic. So it gets reported that they're making progress. They're making progress, absolutely, but they've maintained a generational advantage over Chinese semiconductor production. And it isn't as if they haven't been trying for a long time. I mean, you had a gigantic semiconductor investment fund stood up in 2014. They put in hundreds of billions of dollars into doing this, and they have not been successful yet.
Okay. Last question on this. Will there be a breakthrough? Will the U.S. and China start talking and get some kind of deal? Real quick answers, because we got to move on to the next subject.
Ling Ling.
Ling Ling.
For now, it's really hard to have a breakthrough. I mean, in order to break the logjam we're in right now, I think one thing China could do is to really offer something on fentanyl, to show some good faith effort to the Trump administration that, we're also ready to talk to you about one issue that is of so much importance to America.
Yeah.
I agree with that. That is an area that's ripe for a breakthrough.
Yeah.
I think it's very hard to imagine how sort of all of the issues get resolved. I think we're in a, if we got ourselves some sort of small victories, it'd be around a détente, not a resolution of the tensions.
Ryan, anything to add?
I would just say that the tariff wall is extremely high right now. It will be for a while, but there is still a small exit door available. But to go through it, I think that President Trump will have to open it.
What was so interesting, a year and a half ago, in November, in March of last year, we met with Xi Jinping. 15 Americans met with Xi Jinping, and we asked about fentanyl. And he gave a very articulate answer where he said, we, as a civilization, understand. We had the opium wars. We understand. And of course, we'll do everything we can to prevent the sale of it. He had the wording right of precursors to fentanyl globally. But obviously that hasn't. That's right. That's what I was going to say. It hasn't occurred. So. Ryan, several of the audience members have raised the question of whether, especially Robert Burns from the South Dakota World Affairs Council and Tony Yang from Bonn University, trade disputes heighten the possibility of military conflict, especially over Taiwan?
Well, it's a great question. And for a long time, the United States has warned China that if they were to take military action against Taiwan, that they would face crippling, punishing economic repercussions. And to the extent that we are emptying our cupboard of economic tools now, during peacetime, it sort of limits the credibility of the threat of future economic actions against China if they were to take military action against Taiwan. All that said, my own view is that China is not going to make a decision on use of force in Taiwan based upon a calculation of economic costs. This would be a cosmic roll of the dice for the Chinese leadership. Anything short of absolute and quick victory would imperil, potentially, the hold of the Chinese Communist Party in China. And so it's going to be an extremely high threshold for China to decide to use force. And because of that, I don't think that we are on a knife's edge now. I don't think that conflict is imminent or inevitable. It's possible, and that should keep us sober and concentrate us on preparing for the possibility, but I don't think that it's going to.
Let's see what our audience thinks about that. The poll question, or do you think war between America and China will break out over Taiwan before the end of Trump's second term? 49% say no, 17% say yes, and 35% don't know. I would have thought it would be slightly higher. Matt, highly that it wouldn't occur, but Matt, a memo Defense Secretary Hegseth sent to Pentagon staff last month said China is the pacing challenge and that the department should reorient defense assets towards the protection of Taiwan. Has that strategic vision been implemented so far? And how is the administration changing military strategy and force distribution to respond to China?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a case where we see significant continuity over multiple administrations, right? So when I worked in the Defense Department, when Ryan was my colleague at the NSC back during the Obama administration, Secretary Hagel released a Defense Innovation Initiative at the end of 2014, really about figuring out how do you figure out how the Department of Defense focuses on a new and rising challenge that's coming primarily from China, right? We've watched the same thing during a Trump administration, an announcement of a national security strategy and national defense strategy that announces China as the principal rival that we are focused on. Secretary Austin, his national defense strategy, the headline of that national defense strategy is China is the pacing challenge, right? So Secretary Hez's memorandum is a continuation of those things, right? We've been undergoing this for years. U.S. Pacific Command, now Indo-Pacific Command, is the largest combatant command the United States has had. It's been that way since the 1990s. That's where we field our most advanced military hardware. The United States has been planning for a challenge here for quite some time. And so I think what we're seeing is the continued incremental movements as the United States seeks to reduce its commitments in the Middle East. It seeks to increase burden sharing with our allies in Europe as it rebalances to the Indo-Pacific, right? That's a long-term policy goal of multiple administrations, and we're still continuing to see that go through. And I think we should be relatively confident that those are things that we are able to do.
Higher education, people-to-people exchanges has become a very important part of kind of discussions today. We're seeing the expulsion of, or the revocation of visas for Chinese students in the United States. We're seeing visas not being granted. So let's go to a question from April Mao from the USC US-China Institute Town Hall. There we are.
There we are.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm April Mao, and I am currently an undergrad freshman majoring in communications here at USC. So yeah, I guess my question is also a timely one. So with the recent changes in US immigration policies, how do you foresee these developments affecting Chinese international students and scholars, particularly in terms of visa issuance and academic opportunities? And what advice would you have for them to navigate the current uncertainties?
Ling Ling, can you take that one?
Well,
it's a tough one. Sorry.
It's really a tough one. I came to the United States in 1999 as a student. So also very personal question because I have been asked a lot by some friends, and I think because the much stricter immigration policies these days will definitely lead to delays and difficulties in visa grants for Chinese students, much tougher. And so there are certain fields of study, especially with respect to science and technology. Some of those fields might be off limits to Chinese students going forward. I understand the Chinese leadership is very concerned that they can no longer send Chinese students here to study STEM. So that's a huge concern. What a compare and a contrast. Back in the 90s, when people like me were trying to apply for school here, if you're students specialized in science and technology, it was so much easier than people like me, journalism, right? There's so it's a 180-degree turn. But in terms of advice, I really think you have to really know what you want, right? You want to explore the rest of the world. If that's still go, in addition to the United States, there are also other alternatives as well. And also very important to stay informed based on, informed of what the US policies are. And one other thing is very, very, very important is really be accurate about your documentation. Because, there have been instances where Chinese students, in order to come here, they cut corners and maybe lied about certain things. Don't do that again.
Right. I noticed, in fact, your institution, Hoover, came out with a report today or yesterday.
I did not see it.
Talking about,
I'm sorry.
They analyzed the DeepSeek, the education of the people, the 100 people at DeepSeek.
Okay, you're right, yes.
And they said they were basically not educated in the United States, that they were products of Chinese universities. What's that mean for kind of all of these policies restricting STEM folks from coming here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've known for quite some time that in terms of talent for artificial intelligence, both the United States and China have been neck and neck for quite some time, and so I think we should be not all that surprised that in that particular realm,
right,
that sort of breakdown is not all that is the way it is. So I think we've seen that before. I mean, we've seen this in the artificial intelligence area. It also suggests that obviously you have a very high quality education system inside China, and that's something the United States is going to have to consider and deal with into the future.
Right.
Can I just add one more quick note?
Yep.
And that very high quality higher education system in China actually has benefited from Chinese students studying in countries like the United States. All those sea turtles, so-called sea turtles,
the sea turtles are those who go back.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They went back. They now teach at those universities. They train engineers that now staff DeepSeek and other companies. So this engagement in the past few decades really helped China tremendously.
Yep.
Ryan, Gary Yu of Columbia University asked what April kind of was asking implicitly. Are we seeing a revival of the China Initiative, the Department of Justice initiative launched during Trump 1 that sought to prosecute potential Chinese spies working in American research and industry and in universities?
Well, I will try to tackle this question, but if I can just add one sentence to the discussion that we had just had. I think that having foreign students come to the United States is absolutely essential to the vitality and the strength of the United States. If we're just talking in a US versus China context, China has a population 4 times the size of the United States, which means that the United States needs to have productive capacity 4 times the of China's to be able to be competitive and to retain an edge. The only way that we can do that, Steve, is by bringing the best and the brightest, attracting them as magnets to come to the United States. And we make it hard for bright, talented, ambitious foreign students to come to the United States at their own peril. Which leads me to the question about the China Initiative. So the China Initiative was a program started in the first Trump administration to try to root out industrial espionage and to try to put a real spotlight upon researchers in academia and in industry who were taking direction or funding from China without being transparent about it. And the program came under attack because critics of it felt like it was creating brain drain, causing very talented Chinese people to be sea turtles to go back to China, but also because of the effect that it had on anti-Asian racism in the United States, which was inimical to our core values as a country and a people. And so when President Biden and his administration entered office, they rescinded the China Initiative, largely on the basis of concern about it being a racial profiling tool against Chinese Americans and ethnic Chinese citizens. And so that's where we are now. The members of the House of Representatives have voiced interest in seeing a revival of the China Initiative or something like it. It is also a topic of discussion in conservative policy circles. I don't know where we will go from here, but my one confident prediction is that the more that President Trump becomes disillusioned about the prospect for progress with China, the higher the likelihood there will be of the return of an initiative like this or something resembling it.
But of course, the prosecutions of industrial espionage and research espionage didn't end with the Biden administration's decision to end that.
Right.
They also began a whole process to focus on transnational repression, which is what we were also seeing across this, is that you've got the Chinese state that uses Chinese students and Chinese individuals inside the United States to violate conflicts of commitment, conflicts of interest, and do things and incentivize them to be able to come back and provide the kinds of technologies and things that they would be otherwise denied through export controls and other areas. And in many ways, the Chinese government is the one who chooses to weaponize their own citizens to do those sorts of things. And that's the kind of, those things have not gone down. We watched Director Christopher Wray lay out a significant amounts of evidence of what we were seeing. Those were things we were seeing during the Biden or the Obama administration as well. And I think we've got to be able to sort of call out the kinds of activities that the Chinese government does, placing their own citizens into these kinds of dangerous situations where they're violating U.S. laws.
But rarely students.
Well, certainly graduate students.
I guess
there's not from the FBI. There's not much evidence of that, but certainly there is industrial espionage. But when the FBI investigated how many graduate students were spying, they found a few who filled out forms right, but there weren't a lot of spies. But let's.
I mean, quite a few PLA officers that had lied about themselves on their visa forms,
Yep.
who were then ejected out of the country.
Yep.
Right. So I completely disagree with you that there was no problem with students.
Spying.
Well, those are PLA officers that had lied about what their positions were.
Let's go to Muscatine Community College. Alexia Oliva.
Hello. As said, I am Alexiana Oliva. I'm a student here at Muscatine Community College, and my question is, for decades, the flow of tourists, artists, students, and business people between U.S. and China served as a steady force, even when political tensions are high. But recently, as relations have deteriorated, the flows of people traveling between our two countries have been significantly reduced. How do you think Iowa can maintain a sustainable and effective exchange with China?
Ling Ling?
Again, a tough question given the political environment of today. I guess, people-to-people exchanges, I hate that term because that sounds so jargony, but sorry for lack of creativity here. It's so important to at least maintain some linkage, between these two world powers. We just talked so much about how the engagement really helped pull China out of poverty and develop into such a big country. I think a lot of issues are both sides, right? Take both sides to tango. China's national security law, this campaign to hunt for spies in China, really has had a chilling effect on people traveling there, wanting to work there and study there. And same here, we talked about the China initiative and the consequences as well. For Iowa, you have a very strong agricultural sector. Originally, I'm from a farm province in China. It's called Jiangxi province. So I guess there are some kind of channels you can take advantage of, maybe with Chinese officials, overseeing agriculture sector in some big farm-oriented provinces, and still can keep that kind of dialogue, conversation, and channels going.
Steve, in Washington, where Matt and I live, it's often the U.S.-China relationship is often reduced to the relationship between the two federal governments. And what Ling Ling is pointing to is so important, that there are two sets of relationships between the United States and China. One of them occurs completely independently of the decisions that are being made in Washington. And it's important that that as it serves our interest, that we continue to maintain those connections across the Pacific.
Certainly getting more flights and solving the war in Ukraine will have the ancillary benefit of allowing flights from the United States to China to go over Russia, which will knock 3 to 4 hours off the flying time. Let's talk about technology and national security. Since returning to office, the Trump administration has increased restrictions on China's access to advanced technologies, in particular semiconductors. We polled the audience on their support for this policy. Can we see? I'd be curious where the audience comes out. Is it a good idea? So let's see, 42%.
But only
yes,
for
but only
sensitive.
for the most sensitive. 19% yes, a set of across the board are necessary. 24% no, these policies disrupt global innovation. Industry can regulate itself, and 15% not sure. So a pretty split audience. Matt, what do you think? You worked on this in Trump 1, so you know it pretty well.
And I'm a retired military officer. I still have a lot of friends who are serving, and to be perfectly honest, I have absolutely no problem with denying technology that would make the PLA a better fighting force. I have no problem with that at all.
Right.
So I agree, and I think where we saw the majority of the sort of the place come down is yes, and let's limit those things to the most sensitive sectors. And I think we actually have seen the U.S. government make those kinds of efforts to limit those things to those most necessary sectors. I think that what we should be seeing is much better enforcement of those things. But fundamentally, I think it is, there's a reason why we developed export controls. We developed in 1950, really to impose them first on the PRC during the Korean War. We've kept them in place since then because we're not interested in a potential adversary from gaining advanced military capabilities that could one day kill Americans. And so we're just not interested in that having that happen.
But how do you draw that line? In other words, obviously, should we not sell boots since it makes them
Well, obviously we do sell boots.
But comfortable boots make the military more efficient. Obviously, I'm joking, but where do you draw the line?
Well, I mean, right, so the Export Administration regulations have 10 chapters. Microelectronics, nuclear equipment, right? We can go through the 10 chapters. Each one of those things is very specific of what it lays out, and you can go through and look at those. I mean, it's actually not all that opaque. It's actually fairly clear. There is an effort to portray it that this is unreasonable and that this is unthought out and is not thought through. My contention is that often results from a willingness to cloud the issue, to be able to call those things that I think that are actually quite justified into question, right? We watch this across the semiconductor industry that would love to sell more and more advanced semiconductors to clients there and seek to downplay the risks there. And I think we've got a healthy debate across the U.S. government to be able to draw lines, and we have been drawing lines on this.
Ryan, what do you think about it?
I broadly agree with Matt, so I won't repeat what Matt said. I will just add a few things to it, which is that I see the diffusion of technology much like the spread of water. You can direct it, you can halt it for periods of time, you can dike it, but it's going to spread. We've seen this with every technology that's been produced and throughout humanity. And so let's not have a false sense of complacency about the power of export controls. They are a tool that buy us time and space to try to accelerate our own innovation and to try to limit China from acquiring technology from us that they can use to do harm to the United States. I think that many Americans would come around to being comfortable with that. But that's defensive. What I think is going to be decisive is what we do that is affirmative. Whether it's on education, whether it's on infrastructure, whether it's on attracting talent to want to come and be in the United States and capital as well. That's where sort of the gaps and the deltas are going to emerge, not over export controls.
Yeah, because you have to play both defense and offense, right? I mean, this is not it's not just running a race, right? You actually have to play both. You have to score your own goals, and you have to prevent the other side from scoring their goals, right? That's how you do this over the long term.
Ling Ling, anything you want to add on this one?
100% agreed.
Yeah. I guess from the business point of view, the risk is obviously if we restrict it too much, and so where that line gets drawn, if we restrict it too much, our companies are less profitable, they have less money for R&D, they can't advance as much as they would have otherwise. That's where the discussions that we
One offensive way to think about this is, obviously I agree with Ryan that export controls are primarily a defensive tool, but one offensive way to think about it is about shifting supply chains, right? Yeah. So we all own smartphones, right? Inside there are about 160 semiconductors. Only 2 or 3 of them are their most advanced, right? If you restrict where those semiconductors can go, you actually what you create is restrictions on where they can be manufactured, right? So if your interest is to ensure that actually you don't have an advanced electronics manufacturing industry in one place, you restrict the things that have to go into that. That means they have to be built somewhere else. So you can use those things to shape supply chains and shape behaviors over time. It is not a magical weapon. It has to be used sparingly, but it is not like these things are you're unable to achieve outcomes and to change behaviors of businesses.
Right. Interesting. We have a question from Tai Fan at Colgate University. Tai writes, the United States and China signed an amended science and technology agreement in December. What's in the new agreement? Do you think the current administration will be on board with the agreement? What collaborations or challenges can we expect under the amended agreement?
The agreement, by definition, as I understand it, promote science and technology cooperation between those two big competitors. So I think there are significant challenges for this agreement to be actually implemented under the current administration for all the reasons Ryan and Matt just talked about: the national security concerns, forced technology transfer, China's protection of IP. So I think the agreement actually being implemented, the chances are quite low, unless you disagree. And I would just add one more thing to the great conversation Ryan and Matt just had with you on export controls. So export controls are one tool in the U.S. toolbox, but it's a very potent tool. That the U.S. using it is like hitting China where it hurts. If Xi Jinping had a wish list, there are two things he wants the most, right? Number one, probably Taiwan. Number two is for the U.S. to lift export controls.
Sure.
Because
it's probably a quarter of the time dealing with Biden was on lifting export controls.
Exactly. So it just shows, because Xi Jinping's ambition to make China even greater industrial and technological superpower, they need continued access to this. So the STA, the Science Technology Agreement, definitely would work in China's advantage if that agreement gets implemented and strengthen the kind of cooperation that is very much in doubt right now.
Yeah. End-use controls, not much use in this sector?
Well, I think we've seen that the Bureau of Industry and Security and the Department of Commerce has very little recourse to be able to enforce end-use controls and end users. They have one or two enforcement agents that cover all of China. Mm-hmm. They have to submit requests well in advance to be able to go to a particular facility to follow up on something, right? And so the ability to be able to sort of follow up once the item has been turned over and you've lost custody of it, it's in the Chinese jurisdiction, really difficult to figure out how you actually enforce the follow-through of where it's at.
Is that something that the Trump administration should ask the Chinese? Okay, you want this stuff? Then give us unlimited access to the users, and that we don't have to tell you in advance that we're showing up. We just show up.
The direction is to move in a jurisdictional direction of restricting just the Chinese jurisdiction, right? This is what the Biden administration moved on in terms of the October 7th, 2022 export restrictions on semiconductors, as we move from a by firm, by entity restrictions to a jurisdictional, like nothing can go to China. Right, that's the direction we're moving. We're not moving toward, because largely we don't trust.
And that's the issue. Is if you had enough agents, so literally would be hundreds and hundreds of agents that you would have. The Chinese would have to accept them. They'd have to be allowed to go and do that. But the president cares about the bilateral trade deficit. These things ain't cheap. This would reduce the bilateral trade deficit billions and billions.
That was certainly Xi Jinping's position during the first Trump administration. Is we'd love to solve the trade deficit with buying all the things you restrict. President Trump did not bite that.
No, but the issue would be then we're not going to do that. But if you allow us access to this, to some degree, like when we've discussed, the listing of Chinese companies, my answer was just allow for the audit. Allow for the audit. And ultimately, it took 12 years, but ultimately they did allow for the audit. So it takes time, but ultimately you can sometimes get there with more transparency. Let's go to the global order, which we've talked about. How do cuts to USAID, the State Department now, WHO, the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, WHO, some UN agencies. How will that affect our ability to compete with China? And we polled this issue. Can we have a look at what the audience thinks? Are you concerned that China's globalins? Very concerned. So again, it's very split. third of the people are very concerned, 38%, so obviously 71% are concerned significantly, 22% and 7 are not concerned at all, and 7% don't know. What do you think, Ryan?
Well, my view on this, Steve, is that if the United States does not lead in addressing some of these challenges, a vacuum emerges. And there is no country in the world capable of filling that vacuum. China does not have the capacity to do so now. And if these challenges are not being addressed, whether it's pandemics or the rise of global temperatures, non-proliferation, the potential for out-of-control artificial intelligence, and we can build out this list even further, they're only going to metastasize. The more that these problems metastasize, the greater the risk there is to the health, the security, and the prosperity of the American people. So I think about these cuts in this context much more than I do about it in a zero-sum U.S.-China competition context, because I just don't see how China could fill a vacuum that the United States is creating.
I see. I skipped one of our questions from the World Trade Center in Buffalo, Niagara, which I assume is Niagara Falls. Owen Penhollow.
Hello, I'm Owen, a student at the University at Buffalo. I'm an economics and philosophy, political science and economics major. And my question is, the United States has long viewed its elite colleges and universities as a comparative advantage. This has led to a large transfer of young talent to the US. Given current policies that undercut those institutions, is there an opportunity for China, with a current international student percentage under 1%, to become a global destination for higher education? And if so, is that something China desires?
Who wants to take that? Matt, did you want to take that?
I'll take it. So my simple answer is no, I don't think that they are prepared to take on a large proportion of international students.
Except from Africa.
Which, to change the 1% of kind of where they're at in terms of sort of the idea that the United States, it would shed from the United States and would go to China, I think it's far more likely that, what we're going to see is, increased enrollments in Australia and Western Europe, and Canada. But you're going to still see, I think, a very real number, a very significant number continuing in the United States. I mean, my experience in the first Trump administration is that President Trump felt very strongly that education is an export. He saw it as an export for the United States, and was actually quite against the idea of restricting students on that side, even though he had some security concerns. The idea that the United States would continue to bring in nearly 1 million college students into the United States to be able to practice education and export, a very important thing for the United States to continue to do. So I don't actually expect that to change.
Though for Korean, Japanese, Global South students, China is becoming a real center for education. When you go to these universities, you actually see very significant numbers of folks from other places.
Well, we have seen a lot of students from Africa in Chinese students, and it's because the Chinese government really showered them with scholarships and all that perks. They have been able to attract students from developing countries, but the fundamental is this ideology problem. Do you want to go to Chinese universities and study Xi Jinping thought? That's a question you might want to ask yourself before you make that decision.
Henry O'Connor from the Carter Center asked, in its first 100 days, the Trump administration has been treating allies less as partners and more as targets for pressure and transactional demands. Is a U.S.-led alliance still viable, Matt?
I think it sounds like a question that's trying to answer itself there, but my take on this is that the administration has made it clear that the United States is not going to be able to provide the kinds of broad global goods that it had in the past, right? The idea of market of last resort. The United States essentially unilaterally lowers its trade barriers to allow developing countries to be able to sell into the United States so that they can build themselves up. The United States is going to put more restrictions on that. That's a global good that it's going to restrict. And then I think the other one is sort of collective security. The United States will be the securator of last resort, right, that will provide that global security. And I suspect that what we're seeing in the negotiations between the United States and its allies is the continuation of a long-term process that the United States has had to ask its key allies, who are quite wealthy and quite capable, to do much more in the realm of providing global security goods. This comes to the Europeans. We saw this in the signal chat controversies. We could see this discussion going on, right? An expectation that that trade routes that are through the Red Sea primarily benefit Europe. Why are the Europeans not able to do more in this? An expectation on Japan to move from 1% of GDP on defense to something much higher. The expectation on a number of allies to do much more. Under those scenarios where other allies that are very capable, that are wealthy, that have more than enough ability to be able to do that and provide more global goods for that, you could see you could see an alliance system that is more evenly shared across others, and I think that's what we're seeing push for. This is not a new topic. I mean, Secretary Gates brought it up in the Bush administration and the early Obama administration. We've been asking for this for years and years.
And what does it mean for Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan? First, with respect to Japan and South Korea, troop deployments. Are we going to reduce those troop deployments? And then Taiwan, what does it mean they're going to have to pay for their defense?
Well, I mean, it probably means that Americans can't care more about Taiwan's defense than Taiwanese do, right? So Taiwan is sitting at about 2.3% of GDP on defense. Given the threats that it faces on a day-to-day basis, one would expect that someone would pay a little bit more than that for their own defense. The United States is sitting at about 2.9% of GDP on defense. Japan is at about 1.5% of GDP on defense. Australia is at 2.3% of GDP on defense. Maybe those things were an appropriate level of spending in a fairly benign international environment. We don't live in a benign international environment anymore. Right, our 2% GDP defense spending for NATO was agreed on in 2012, right? Before the annexation of Crimea, before all of those sorts of things. We still don't have NATO allies that fulfill those requirements, right? So until those things are fixed, it's hard to expect American taxpayers to care a lot more about their security.
And what does it mean for troop deployments in South Korea and
I think
Japan?
those, obviously those things were under discussion during the first Trump administration. My sense is that they came to a set of agreements. I don't know if things will be opened up again. But the expectation is that allies will do much more about their own defense.
Fascinating. The question move on to kind of some other issues. We have a question from Horace Wong, a research analyst at Fontainebleau Capital. He asks if there's potential for climate change cooperation between China and U.S. states and cities. Brian?
Well, I think that there is the possibility of climate cooperation at the sister city and sister state province level. I think California is really sort of a pathbreaker in this regard. They have relationships both with the Chinese central government but also with several provinces in Shanghai. And there are things for both sides to learn, best practices to share, whether it's about reducing air pollution, dealing with climate adaptation. And I expect that those things will continue because it serves both sides' interest to do so. However, the question didn't ask this, but I would be a little bit more pessimistic about the possibility of climate returning to the center of the U.S.-China government-to-government relationship at the central level, solely because I think that there's a widespread view that, in Washington at least, that China tried to instrumentalize climate issues to influence American behavior on other issues, and that the United States should not transfer that much leverage to China on this issue. And so, yes, at the state and city level, I expect the climate cooperation to continue. At the federal level, I expect it to be pretty chilly.
Yeah. What other areas are there for cooperation? I mean, climate change used to be the bright, shining example of potential cooperation. Are there other areas, or is basically it's going to be tough going?
Well,
no areas where we can cooperate. There's no, I mean, I think of Ebola and Chinese and American scientists working together then, but I don't see, obviously that did not happen during COVID.
I could come up with a lot of areas where I think it would serve mutual self-interest for us to pool capabilities, share best practices, and work together. But if I was going to be honest with the moment that we're in, I think that a good place for us to focus our attention is on reducing mutual risks. What we saw, for example, in the Biden administration was President Biden and President Xi agreeing that on the issue of artificial intelligence, that it should not be used to decide nuclear launches, that only humans should have the capacity to put their finger on the trigger. When we look back further, there has been progress in rules of behavior for when U.S. and Chinese forces are operating in close proximity to each other that have lowered the risk of unintended conflict between our two countries. So as we look to cyber, as we look to space, as we look to new and emerging technologies, I think this is the space where there would be mutual self-interest in finding ways to lower the probability of unintended conflict.
Yeah. Unfortunately, in many of those cases, those things have been held hostage to other things, as we've seen in military to military discussions, over the years, have been, those talks have been held hostage to other issues, and that's really an unfortunate development. That's how, in my opinion, Beijing views those things as that the United States wants those talks and communications more, and therefore it uses them as leverage to achieve other goals.
Yeah. It is surprising that fentanyl, which should be able, I think, as Ling pointed out earlier, that should be one where the Chinese are willing to cooperate in exchange for nothing.
You would think,
it's just,
you would think not killing
it's like
70,000 Americans a year.
There's a moral imperative.
Yeah. One would suggest that because they have not acted on it, there are some acts of omission and commission happening.
Yeah. Of course, the Chinese will say they have acted on it, that on January 27th, they gave the U.S. government a proposal and additional things they were going to do on fentanyl, and we haven't.
Don't believe it.
But
don't believe it.
Well, they did have I haven't seen the proposal. They did give the proposal. Both sides confirmed that there was a proposal given, but the U.S. side said it was inadequate.
Steve, I think that your point is really important, and I'm glad that you brought it up, because we've spent most of the hour talking about the U.S. side of the U.S.-China relationship, but the reality is that this is a two-player game. It's an interactive dynamic, and of course the focus of this town hall is on the first 100 days of the Trump administration, but you raised a very important point.
Yeah. We kind of talked about this briefly, but we've seen several meetings between the U.S. and Chinese officials, but talk about how robust bilateral communications are and how we can, potentially improve them, because we're not seeing the meetings. The Chinese say, again, and I don't know, but they said they tried to have a meeting between Rubio and Wang Yi in Munich. He came to New York, that is, Wang Yi came to New York and asked for a meeting, and neither of those were granted. So where are we going, and where should we go? And then we'll need to close.
Oh, sure. Well, the short answer is that communication between the two sides is not at all robust. We're seeing very little. We know, there have been frequent meetings between National Security Council with the Chinese embassy, and that's pretty much it. The Chinese delegation to the IMF World Bank meetings just left this afternoon. The amount of time they stayed in Washington, exact 24 hours.
24 hours.
24 hours. They arrived sometime yesterday and left this afternoon. Not 1 minute more, not 1 minute less. And our reporting shows that there's some chatter on the sidelines of the IMF meetings, but nothing bilateral. It was very, in the context of multilateral meetings. So right now we're kind of stuck, right? As you pointed out earlier, the Chinese tried to reach out to the Trump administration, but there was such a mismatch. Trump people wanted to talk to the key players in Beijing, including Cai Qi, whose portfolio includes cybersecurity, which is a core concern for the U.S. But the Chinese answer said that's not how we work, because we want to go through the diplomatic channel. And then diplomatic channel, you pointed out, when Foreign Minister Wang Yi was here, he couldn't get any meeting with Secretary of State Rubio or National Security Advisor Waltz. And part of the reason was because he told Rubio to behave himself, basically, during their first introductory call. That kind of, wasn't a great start, right, for an administration who thought thought they had so much leverage. We're not going to take this, right? So, and now, because of the maximum pressure from the Trump administration, Xi Jinping, it would be really, look really bad for him if he were to actively reaching out to the Trump administration. So, we're kind of in a standstill right now. It's really, it has to take both sides to break the logjam. Yeah. For China's side, we talked about fentanyl.
Yeah. Matt, anything you wanted to add on this? We're out of time, so.
Yeah, just that it doesn't look like the time is ripe for those kinds of interactions. I would contend that there is communication, right? Like each side are sending messages and the other side is receiving them, right? It may not be they're sitting down in a room together, but they're certainly sending messages to each other,
right? And
they're certainly being received. And so I think we should think about it broadly on that setup. Obviously Beijing would love to have start at the lower level and slowly work your way up and resolve issues, and then the leaders go to it. That's certainly not the style that the president wants. And it's not clear that just because the Chinese side wants it, that's the appropriate way. The American way could be just as appropriate, right? There is really no reason to dismiss the way the United States has approached this as the wrong approach.
Ryan, final word.
As a former diplomat, Steve, it pains me to see the lack of creativity and imagination that is on display. This is a solvable problem, and I hope that sometime soon both sides figure out a way to communicate more directly with each other.
Yeah. Well, they may not be communicating, but this group certainly has been communicating. This has been just fabulous. We could continue this for hours, but unfortunately we don't have the luxury tonight. I just want to thank the three of you for doing a spectacular job, and sharing your insights. I've learned a lot from this. This has been great. The bilateral relationship is simply too important for the United States and China to get wrong, and your expertise elevates our national discourse on the topic, and I thank you. Before we go, I'd be remiss to also not thank several others who made tonight's Chinatown Hall possible. Our partners across the United States, Canada, and China for hosting. Our local experts, we have local experts placed at all of the venues who speak to the audience at our partner venues, and the Star Foundation for its continued generosity and funding. And finally, our National Committee staff who work hard to organize this nationwide event. Thank you three, and thank you all for joining us.